Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth-generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever thought about what happens to you if you can't work? And I mean specifically, say like your operation, your farm, your business. What happens if you can't work for whatever the reason? Maybe your kid is sick and you got to be at the hospital for, a long time. Maybe you get injured, or maybe you're sick and you need to be in the hospital. Either way, you cannot be involved in the day-to-day operations of your farm, of your business, of your livelihood, so to speak. So what gets me to thinking about this is when it comes to this topic around for this week's episode of, what happens to you if you can't work, is we've got a local operation here that just recently, within the last week or so, got a feed yard, and this guy that owns it and operates it, this is probably about a 6,000 or 7,000 head feed yard. So a really good sizable operation. Probably, if I had to guess, roughly 5, 6, or 7 employees involved, quite a few people involved. But also with this operation, he had really no succession plan, nobody to really take over the day-to-day operations. Now, he did not die or pass away, but this guy was injured. He fell off of a horse, got bucked off, and got injured pretty good and is in the hospital. We had actually sold this operation, sold the feed yard some alfalfa. So, we called him up, hey, looking to maybe start hauling this alfalfa in. When does it work? And he's like, well, I'm in the hospital. I can't facilitate this right now. And so then all of a sudden we get a call from somebody else, a family member of his, some other random guy that's trying to step in to fill in his shoes so they can manage the operation. Luckily in that case, that scenario there, at least he's still alive. He's still there to facilitate, okay, this is what needs to happen, or at least tell somebody who's running basically the day-to-day operations from that point on, this is what needs to be done. But how many times, think back to something local to you or something close to you where you saw somebody that actually did pass away, they're no longer here. And the operation that they left behind, there was no organization, nothing was written down, everything was in their head, and everything was ran, maybe a little bit chaotically. And so the person who had to step in and take that over, whether it be their son, their daughter, their wife, whatever the case may be, they had to basically take on this mess and they had to figure it out on their own, and caused so much stress and such a burden on their strollers, then they had to try to figure this out. So this just caused me to really take a step back and think about, because I think most operations, most farming operations out there, farming, ranching, whatever the case may be, we don't have a lot of steps in place if something were to happen to us. This all kind of comes back to running a centralized operation. And so everything runs through us. Everything involves us, all of our day-to-day businesses and everything that goes about. And so, when it comes to talking about this is, if you aren't there anymore, for whatever the case may be, what happens? But also I want to ask you the question of what would you want to happen if you were not there? Just take a step back, think through this scenario as you're listening to this episode, wherever you're at in your season of life or your operation, whatever that looks like. Take a step back and ask, what would I want to actually happen if something happened to me? Whether that be something in the short term or something in the long term, as in you do pass away. What happens? A lot of times this isn't very comfortable to think about, but we need to actually sit down and think about this. So what happens to you, or what would you like to happen to your operation? Do you want it to carry on? Do you want it to be business as usual? Do you want it to thrive? Or the alternative, do you want it to crumble and fall? Do you want to cause stress to everyone around you? Do you want the operation, your farm, your business that you've worked your entire life to build, do you want that to cease to exist? So these are some questions that we need to ask ourselves. And I think at the end of the day, we're like, yeah, I would like it to carry on to some extent, or at least not provide such a stress or burden on those around me, my family members or my kids, or whatever the case may be. We don't necessarily want that. I don't think anybody would want that. So when it comes to looking at this and trying to really think about this and analyze this, there's two sides that I can see this, or kind of two components to really analyze here. I think one would be like kind of like the operations, the day-to-day operations, and two would be like the financial side of things. Obviously, if you can't work, there's the literal day-to-day, this needs to be done, the operations that need to be taken care of, that's going to need to be figured out, essentially. Now, the financial side of things, if you can't work, what happens to the financial side as far as like if you're the sole provider of your household? There's a couple different things there a guy can really dive into and really analyze and think about. So that's why I wanted to start here with the operations side, because that was kind of what I really got exposed to here with this, like I said, this accident with this guy that owns the feed yard here. And so, just think about looking at your operation, who's on your team, who's on your team, really kind of keep in mind who's all on your team. Do you have teammates, or is it just you? Is it maybe you and your son, or maybe you and your dad? Who's all involved in the operation? And from there, we look at who takes over your tasks and responsibilities upon you being, whether that's incapacitated or just not there anymore, or just even looking at going on vacation. Just who takes over your roles and responsibilities in the event that you no longer can? Who would be that person? Even if it's just a friend, maybe it's a distant family member that at least knows your operation. Think through that. Who would actually be the person that takes over my roles and responsibilities? And also, who knows the operation like you do? Now, the answer to this one is quite literally nobody knows the operation like you do. But who is somebody that is well informed enough, that has the skills, the knowledge, the expertise to actually come in, to maybe step in and play more of an advisor role, or at least step in and be able to take care of things, make sure your business does carry on, and it is business as usual. Who is willing to actually be able to do that? Who do you know who would be willing to actually do that? And then, does your operation fail or succeed in this instance? That's what we talked about before, as far as, what do you want to happen? Does it carry on, or is it business as usual, or what is actually happening? Well, in most cases, I'd say most cases, a lot of operations would probably fail, or maybe not fail, but definitely not thrive. That would be to where we're providing a lot of stress, anxiety, and burden to those around us. So we got to just really think about what actually is going to happen. When it comes down to the daily operations, to kind of take you through this little bit of an exercise here, something to think about is what I call the accountability chart. Essentially, what this means is to take some time to really sit down and analyze every task, every responsibility, every role in your operation, and really take a step back and analyze this. All the tasks that you do on a day-by-day basis or daily basis throughout the year, throughout different seasons of the year, let's sit down and really actually lay this out. Let's put it on a piece of paper. Maybe break it down into categories. Okay, so for the operations side, let's break that down into maybe the crop side. From there, maybe we've got planting, we've got harvest. What do you do? Is there somebody else in your operation? Maybe you or your dad. What does your dad do? What are you responsible for? Break down every little task. And at this point, I guess, don't necessarily put a person's name on it, but just break down in your operation, what is every task that needs to be done, needs to be taken care of. And from there, let's go one step further. And that's where we want to actually assign a name, assign somebody who's responsible. And if it's just, like I said, you, yourself, and I responsible for all this stuff, it's going to be you wearing all these hats. So I go back to think about all the hats that we wear within an operation, all the different roles that are on our plates, and all the hats that we need to wear throughout the different seasons of the operation as well. Kind of a side story here when it comes to hats. I think it's very relatable when it comes to farming because, as you know, most farmers generally have a lot of hats. I am one of those people. I'm a hat guy. I'm always wearing a hat as much as I can. Basically, if I'm not wearing a hat, I'm probably in church. So I've got tons of different hats, and you always get a hat from all these different seed dealers. You get a hat from, every Tom, Dick, and Harry out there that's selling something or that you've bought something from. So I've always got a ton of hats. But I was also thinking back to, imagine if you just had a bunch of white hats, and for each hat or each different role or responsibility you play in the operation, you just wrote that on there. So like one day I'm a marketing advisor, and one day I'm an economist. The next day I'm an agronomist. The next day, I'm a weatherman, or I'm a livestock guy, or, I'm a veterinarian. All of those different things, all the different hats that we wear, man, you'd probably have 100 different hats that you rotate through on a daily basis even sometimes. So really think about just kind of going back here to this accountability chart, visually laying out everything that you do. Break it down into like a chart. That's why it's called accountability chart. but literally break this down. So, you start at your operation. From there, you go down. Okay, what are these different roles? Maybe we've got the cattle operation and the row crop operation, and we've got just all the different roles that fall under each of those different categories there. So really just break that down so we can see what this actually looks like. Now, the goal here, the thing that you'll probably realize if you take the time to sit down and do this, is you are generally wearing a lot of hats and you are responsible for a lot of things. Now, this can be very eye-opening if you do this for the first time because you actually sit back and you're like, wow, I do all of those things? Yeah, you do. I think a lot of times we definitely try to, I guess I shouldn't say we try to, but we generally, as a business owner, we undervalue and underrate ourselves. That being said, if somebody had to come in and fill everything that you do in the operation, I don't think you give yourself enough credit for everything that you actually do. And that's what this exercise is for, is to actually step back and realize everything that you're responsible for. And by doing this, you'll realize that in most cases, you probably have a very centralized operation, very centralized as in everything revolves around you. Everything revolves around you. Now, I'm generally talking about maybe a smaller operation where it's just Junior and Junior's dad or whoever's involved. Now, if you do have a larger operation with several team members, it still might be the case where you have a centralized operation because you want that control. You are afraid to actually let go of some of that control, so you have a hard time letting others do some things. So even though you might have team members, you maybe not give them the full responsibility that they need. So now on the flip side, maybe you've got a really good team and you do let them have some of those roles and responsibilities. That's ultimately where we're going to get to go at the end of the day. And I think it's just important to realize that even if you've got a small operation, it's just you yourself or just you and your dad, we can still set up some sort of decentralized command here. So that way, in the event that something happens to you, even if you're a one-man show, that we can have something in place, something that makes sure that the day-to-day operations continue. So that way, all these burdens of the day-to-day operations, all the financial side doesn't come falling down onto those around you. And at the end of the day, this big asset that we have, this big livelihood, is no longer an asset, it's a liability. It's a liability because all of a sudden somebody has to come in and fill your shoes, doesn't know what they're doing, and this causes a lot of stress and anxiety onto them because they just want to carry on what you built, but they can't. They can't because it all ultimately comes down to you, that one that was in charge and didn't take the time to actually put down all of these things on a paper. So when it kind of comes down to, say, just having a one-man show, who knows your operation functions? Who knows, like I mentioned before, is there anybody that's around you that you could maybe at least bring in? Like come in maybe once a month, just show them a few things. This is what I do. This is how I do it. Especially when it comes to, say, like a livestock operation where things need to happen on an everyday basis, need to take care of those livestock versus like a grain operation. Things don't happen for a week. It's probably not the end of the world. But livestock, they got to be fed, they got to be cared for, they got to be taken care of. And so that's one thing that might be something to consider is take somebody in, maybe somebody that's close to you that you can really trust and get to know the day-to-day operations. Let them help you out from time to time. Who can step in? Do you have the things actually written down that you need to? That's another big one there. I remember going back to the livestock side of things, this was probably, I don't know, about 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I don't know for sure when it was, but there was a couple that ran basically a small feed yard, and they actually both passed away tragically in a car accident. And they had cattle on feed, and they had nothing written down, no really record-keeping system as far as how many calves they had, or this pen of cattle got this ration, and all that other fun stuff. And I think it was a pretty big mess trying to sort that out. And so just think about what you're trying to do, really write everything down, even the little things that you don't think about. Let's get to writing this stuff down, at least so people would have records if they could actually come in and take care of the day-to-day things. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm just thinking about, say on a livestock operation, write down all your rations, maybe write down your pen of cattle. Maybe if you're shipping cattle, or maybe you've sold some cattle, or maybe you've bought some hay, you've bought some corn, write down all of this stuff so that way people know what's actually happening. Same for the livestock side, the row crop side. When it comes to maybe you bought these inputs, they're at this location, you've talked to this person, that's your point of contact. This is your seed dealer, this is your agronomist, and they know your plan. And then you got your marketing advisor, at least, or somebody there that's knows all of your crop plans there, knows all your marketing plans that you've sold, maybe you forward contracted. So you've got these contracts at this location for this delivery date, for this price. So you've got all of this stuff written down somewhere. Now, it's always good to have this stuff written down somewhere for our own needs anyways, just for our own needs, just for record-keeping side of things. But just imagine, I'm just talking here specifically, in the event that you're not here, somebody else can step in, they can come into your office, they can sit down and say, okay, this might be a challenge, but at least we can make sense of things. At least we can work with this. At least we can carry on and try to do the best we can with business as usual. And so as far as the day-to-day operations side of things, that's really going to be kind of rounding out there as far as just making sure you've got something written down so we're well aware that if somebody would just step into our shoes, they could manage, they could try to do it. So now let's flip this to the second component here when it comes to the financial side. There's a lot more things that we could actually consider, or a lot more suggestions to make here to really help with the financial side, as far as if you're incapacitated, or if you're just laid up, or if you're disabled and you can no longer work, or if you're just no longer here anymore. Maybe you do pass away. There's a lot of things that we can do and we can really consider here. Now, I'm going to also break this down into two things here. Basically, if you can't work, but you're still here, but you just can't work. So we need to consider, where does your income come from? Pay someone else versus helping you. Are you going to have to pay somebody? Are you going to have to pay somebody to help out, to go feed the cattle every day, or to go plant the crop because you're disabled? Do you have disability insurance, or do you have some sort of savings in place? Or, this term around, this is actually a term that I was presented with a while back, is, how many months do you own? How many months do you own? So if you take kind of what are your living expenses on a monthly basis, and you take on all the cash that you have in your savings or your current capital, your current working capital, and you figure out how many months that you own. So at least you have the security there. If something happens to you, you can't work, you're disabled, you're laid up in a bed, laid up in the hospital, you can't get out there and do the day-to-day things that you need to, or at least in that event, you're going to have to pay somebody to help you. This is going to be a pretty big financial burden to you. Not just from, say, the financial side that's coming in from all the expenses for, say, health expenses and all that stuff, but just even from an operations standpoint, everything that's going to be leaving because you're not there to take care of your tasks. You're going to have to pay somebody. So there's some things there that we need to consider, but also, where does your income actually come from? If your income literally comes from you getting out there working on a day-to-day basis, you may be putting a few too many eggs in one basket. That'd be definitely one thing to consider as well, because if you're not there, basically you're probably screwed. And I think for most cases, for most farmers, for most ranchers out there, that's probably the case. And that's probably a sad reality, but it's also, that's why we're here to talk about this, is here to bring awareness to this, something to just consider. So that way, in the event that the worst case does happen, at least we have possibilities here of some different things that we can do. So now to flip this on, and we talked about, if you're here, you just can't work. Okay, but what if you're not here? What if you do pass away? The worst case scenario. Do you have life insurance? How much life insurance do you have? Is it enough to get by with, or is it enough to live comfortably? Do you have enough to pay off your debt? So these are some different things to consider. Most of us do generally have life insurance, but as we grow and our operations evolve, do we have enough to kind of cover the debts that we have? Do we have enough to cover that opportunity that we took on 5 years ago that put us in quite a bit of debt? Do we have enough for our family to live comfortably, or is it just kind of enough to get us by for a couple of years? This is something that we definitely need to consider. The other thing here is, are you the main provider of the household? Are you the main provider of the income? And so maybe you're a farming operation, maybe you're a substantial operation to where your wife just stays home with the kids, nothing wrong with that, but you're the sole provider, the farm is the sole provider. But if you're not here anymore, does that mean that your wife is going to have to go get a job down the road? I don't know. Something to consider there, right? So that's where we need to be mindful of who's the sole provider here. And if the sole provider of the household is gone, then what happens? Then what happens? So I know we can definitely get into a rabbit hole here as to when it comes to the family side of things, say if you're involved with a father-son operation, or in-laws, a partnership or a corporation, LLC, or the case, there's lots of different scenarios a guy could run down through here, but just something to keep in mind here. And I think at the end of the day, I don't want to go on and on too much, but at the end of the day, I just want you to think about this scenario, because we've all had this play out in front of us to a certain extent, I'm sure, or maybe it's happened to you. Maybe it's happened to you firsthand, but generally it's somebody that's close to us where we saw somebody that passed away and they were left high and dry for multiple different reasons. So what can you do listening to this right now to just think about this, to at least be aware? That's what I really want to drive home here, is just to be willing to think about the uncomfortable, or would you rather live out the uncomfortable? I'd rather think about the uncomfortable, but then live out my normal day-to-day life, right? Rather than having to live through the hell, live through the pain, the stress, and the burden of something be coming down on my shoulders or coming down on my family's shoulders, and I'm not there to help. So at the end of the day, that's where this comes into play, is we just need to be aware, and we need to know our current situation, know what we currently have set up, know that how is this going to play out in worst case scenario, maybe run some different scenarios in our head, maybe put some things down on paper, maybe make sure we're actually trying to keep good records rather than trying to speed through our day-to-day. Maybe just take a step back. Take a step back and acknowledge that I could be doing this a little bit better. I should maybe write some things down on the day-to-day operations, but then I should also maybe take a look when I'm in the office of how much life insurance do I actually have? What are actually monthly expenses? Am I the sole provider of the operation? If I'm not here, if I'm not the one that's actually going to be able to bring in the income to my family to put food on the table and clothes on my kids' back to make sure our house mortgages still gets paid, what happens? These are very uncomfortable situations, very uncomfortable conversations. But at the end of the day, would you rather think about the uncomfortable or would you rather live through it? So that's kind of the question I'm going to leave you with today. And if you don't know the answer, well, I think then that's a different conversation as well. So at the end of the day, that's all I got for this week's episode, and we will catch you next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more, follow me on Instagram @GarrettRuskamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more conviction through clarity.